The hearing that turned the tables. In a softly lit conference room nestled deep within the labyrinth of Capitol Hill, a group of Democratic strategists gathered around a gleaming oak table. The faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead cast a sterile glow, illuminating the faces of those present, each brimming with a cautious optimism. Senator Chris Van Hollen stood at the head, his hands steady as he placed a thick folder marked with the USAID logo onto the table's polished surface. This, he announced, his voice carrying the weight of revelation, is a deportation order from the Trump administration carried out in direct defiance of a unanimous 9-0 Supreme Court ruling. He opened the folder, revealing a document emblazoned with a stark red stamp, its edges crisp against the dim light. This was never meant to happen. Across from him, Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez leaned forward, her fingers flipping through the pages with the precision of a litigator preparing for trial. "This is our opening," she said, her voice sharp with conviction, a faint smile betraying her confidence. "It's a clear violation of due process, a betrayal of justice. All we need to do is lay it bare before the public, and the Republicans will collapse under their own contradictions." Representative Jamie Raskin, seated nearby, nodded with a quiet satisfaction, his eyes gleaming with the promise of a political victory. "We'll call for a hearing, build a narrative of executive overreach. By the time they scramble to defend themselves, the story will already be written." Their voices resonated with a shared certainty, a rhythm unbroken by hesitation. They envisioned a public spectacle, a nationally broadcast event where the Republican Party would buckle under the weight of their own missteps, unable to escape the glare of accountability. That evening, Van Hollen's team moved swiftly, drafting and submitting a formal request for a congressional hearing to address the violation of the Supreme Court's mandate. The Senate, with surprising speed, approved the request within 24 hours, setting a date and granting camera access to ensure the nation would witness the proceedings. In private moments, the Democrats exchanged knowing glances and murmured asides, their confidence palpable. The self-proclaimed champions of law and order, AOC, whispered during a press conference, her tone laced with irony, are about to be exposed for their hypocrisy. But across the city, in a modest Republican office, bathed in the soft glow of a single desk lamp, a different scene unfolded. Senator Josh Hawley sat in silence, his eyes fixed on the same USAID document, its pages spread across a cluttered desk. He slid the folder toward Senator John Kennedy, who read with deliberate care, his fingers lingering on a critical footnote. "They're pointing to the deportation," Kennedy said, his voice low and measured. "But the real story is the delay in enforcement, 11 months of inaction all on their watch." J.D. Vance, seated nearby, opened his laptop, pulling up DHS records and aligning them with the court's timeline. "They didn't follow through," he said, his tone matter of fact, "not even close." Stephen Miller stepped into the circle of light, his expression unreadable. "I've reviewed the internal memos," he said. "Deliberate delays, political maneuvering. They didn't just sideline justice, they buried it for strategic gain." Kennedy leaned back in his chair, a faint smirk crossing his face. "They think they're putting us in the dock with this hearing. They haven't read the details closely enough." Hawley adjusted his sleeves, his movements precise. "We don't fight the hearing. We embrace it. Their platform becomes ours." That night, the Republicans filed their response, agreeing to participate and requesting a national broadcast. The Democrats believed they were setting a trap, but a single overlooked detail, the 11-month delay in their own administration's response to the court's ruling, would soon redefine the entire narrative. 2 days later, the Senate chamber was transformed into a stage of marble and microphones, its air thick with anticipation. The hum of cameras filled the room, capturing the murmurs of the gathered crowd, the tense postures of staff, and the eager scribbling of reporters in the gallery. Senator Hawley presided at the front, his demeanor calm and composed, as if he had anticipated every move in this high-stakes chess game. The Democratic contingent took their seats across the aisle, their expressions radiating the confidence of those expecting a decisive victory. Senator Van Hollen adjusted his jacket and leaned into the microphone, his voice steady and deliberate. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman," he began. "We are here today not for political games, but to uphold a fundamental principle. This deportation executed under the previous administration directly violated a unanimous 9-0 Supreme Court ruling, a clear, unambiguous mandate that was ignored." He raised the USAID folder for emphasis, its weight, symbolic of the accusation. AOC followed, her eyes locked on the camera lens, her voice sharp with conviction. A man was torn from his family, his life uprooted before the law could protect him. This isn't merely a legal misstep, it's a moral failing of governance. Raskin added, his tone measured but firm. If the executive branch can disregard the highest court in the land, the rule of law becomes a choice, not a foundation. We're here to expose the consequences of unchecked power. A brief silence followed the cameras, panning across the room. The Republicans sat motionless, their silence deliberate, until Hawley nodded to Kennedy. The Louisiana senator rose, his movements unhurried, his voice carrying a deliberate cadence. "Senator Van Hollen," he began, "you claim this deportation defied the Supreme Court's ruling. But if that ruling was issued over a year ago, why did your administration sit idle for 11 months without enforcing it?" The question hung in the air, sharp and unyielding. Van Hollen blinked, caught off guard. AOC shifted in her seat, her earlier confidence wavering. Raskin opened his mouth to respond, then hesitated. Kennedy pressed forward, his tone unrelenting. "You're not just pointing to actions taken under Trump. You're glossing over your own administration's failure to act on a unanimous court order." He stepped back, his point made. Hawley's voice followed, calm and formal. "The committee will now admit into evidence documents submitted by Senator Kennedy outlining the delays in implementation following the Supreme Court's decision." As the papers were distributed, the atmosphere in the chamber shifted. Kennedy's folder was more than a collection of pages. It was a meticulously constructed timeline. Behind him, a screen lit up the number 11 months, displayed in bold, unmissable text. J.D. Vance rose next, his voice low but cutting. "This was a constitutional mandate, not a suggestion. Yet under your administration, the Department of Homeland Security took no action, no reversal, no acknowledgement for 338 days. He pointed to the screen, walking the committee through the evidence. "Here's the date of the ruling. Here's a DHS memo issued 5 days later instructing to hold implementation until further notice. And here's the communication log showing no action for nearly a year." AOC remained still, her earlier fire subdued. Raskin tapped his pen against the table, his brow furrowed. Van Hollen reached for a glass of water, his silence speaking volumes. Stephen Miller stepped forward, his demeanor cold and methodical. "I'd like to introduce an exhibit," he said, holding up a stack of papers. "These are verified internal emails between DHS officials and senior White House policy staff obtained through lawful FOIA requests." He read aloud, his voice devoid of emotion. Quote, "Delaying compliance with the Supreme Court's ruling provides narrative flexibility. Reframe as reform, not reversal. Another, implementation may conflict with election year messaging. Recommend holding until after the midterm cycle." The room fell silent, the hum of the cameras the only sound. Hawley spoke, his tone measured. Let the record reflect that these materials have been reviewed and accepted into evidence. The committee will proceed with further questioning. Van Hollen raised a hand, his voice defensive. Those emails are not official directives. They're internal discussions, not approved policy. Kennedy responded without missing a beat. But they were followed, weren't they? No one overrode them. No one acted. You waited. Raskin interjected, his voice strained. You're spinning a delay into a conspiracy. Bureaucracies move slowly. Everyone knows that. Vance countered immediately, his tone sharp. Not when the law demands immediate action. This wasn't a bureaucratic snag. It was a deliberate choice. He turned to the press gallery, his words carrying beyond the chamber. This hearing, intended to expose an abuse of power, now reveals who truly disregarded the law. The dynamic had shifted irrevocably. The Democrats, once poised as prosecutors, were now on the defensive, their narrative unraveling under the weight of their own inaction. The crowd leaned forward, sensing the change. Outside headlines began to shift, social media buzzing with new framings. The Republicans weren't done. Vance stood again, holding a folder marked in blue ink. Since we're discussing the rule of law, he said, let's broaden the conversation. A chart appeared on the screen, its numbers stark and undeniable. Since January 2021, over 20 million individuals have crossed into the United States illegally, not under Trump, but under this administration. How many hearings have we held for the American families affected by crimes committed by those individuals? None. Yet for one deportation case now reversed, you've mobilized the full weight of Congress. AOC leaned forward, her voice sharp with indignation. You're conflating a humanitarian error with millions of people. That's not just misleading. It's morally bankrupt. Vance didn't flinch. No, I'm exposing a double standard. Your outrage is selective, timed for maximum political impact. Miller placed a fresh document on the table, his voice steady. This memo, dated 2 months after the Supreme Court's ruling, comes from the White House Political Affairs Office. It reads, postpone compliance. Narrative priorities are not aligned. Recommend delay to avoid undermining broader immigration messaging. Raskin pushed back his tone defensive. That's not a directive. It's a discussion point. Miller looked up, unflinching. And yet, for 11 months, nothing happened. The discussion became the policy. Van Hollen spoke, his voice quieter, less certain. You're oversimplifying a complex process. Coordination between agencies. International considerations. These things take time. Kennedy cut in, his tone sharp but controlled. A 9-0 Supreme Court ruling doesn't require interpretation. It requires compliance. What you call complexity, the law calls obstruction. The Democrats' earlier confidence had evaporated. AOC sat silent, her arms crossed tightly. Raskin stared at his notes, no longer reading them. The hearing, once their weapon, was now a battlefield where they were losing ground. Miller presented another document, his voice unwavering. This note, verified by the Office of the Inspector General, details a meeting 4 days after the ruling between DHS legal staff and White House communications advisors. The recommendation, delay enforcement, to secure narrative control. AOC broke her silence, her voice sharp. You're inferring intent from staff chatter. That's not evidence. Miller didn't look her way. Intent is clear when inaction aligns perfectly with political strategy. Van Hollen, his tone subdued, said, no official order was issued to defy the ruling. That matters, Kennedy replied, his eyes fixed on the senator. The absence of a written order isn't a defense when silence achieves the same result. The overhead monitors flickered a new email chain appearing in stark black and white. Its subject line read, "Delay compliance timing risks, pre-midterms." Kennedy read aloud, his voice steady. Quote, "Implementing the SCOTUS ruling risks disrupting our immigration messaging. Recommend delay until post-election communication strategy is in place." The room was still, the weight of the words settling over the chamber. Miller continued, his tone precise. These emails were sent, received, and acted upon. They weren't drafts. They were policy. Van Hollen's hands gripped the table's edge, his earlier composure fraying. Raskin spoke, his voice softer. Planning doesn't equal execution. Internal discussions don't define intent. Hawley tilted his head slightly. So your defense is that a direct instruction to delay, followed by 11 months of inaction, is merely conversation, Vance added. Intent is revealed in outcomes. This wasn't coincidence. It was design. Van Hollen's voice was barely above a whisper. I was not aware of that communication. Kennedy met his gaze. Someone was, and they acted on it. The air grew heavier, the room quieter. Outside reporters huddled around their devices, the phrase "delay until post-election" looping on live feeds. Social media churned hashtags, shifting as the narrative flipped. Hawley called a brief recess, the gavel's tap cutting through the silence. The Democrats weren't preparing their next move. They were grappling with how to explain what had been exposed. Kennedy stood, his hands empty. Let me be clear, he said. No one is accusing anyone of treason. No one claims the Constitution was torn apart. But when the Supreme Court speaks with one voice and the response is calculated, silence for 11 months, that's not an oversight. That's a decision. AOC fired back, her voice colder than before. You're turning political caution into a crime. This is performance, not oversight. Vance leaned in, unflinching. Then explain the 11 months. Explain the memos prioritizing messaging over law. If this is caution, it's the most politically convenient caution in recent memory. Miller rose again, holding a single sheet. This timeline, built from your own documents, shows the ruling date, the memo date, the media strategy meeting, and the lack of action for 11 months. That's not bureaucracy. It's intent. Van Hollen's fingers tapped the table, a slow, unconscious rhythm. Raskin tried to regain ground. Government isn't a machine. You don't input a ruling and expect instant results. Kennedy responded instantly. There's a difference between slow and silent. One is procedural, the other is strategic. Vance added, you treat judicial mandates like press releases, optional, disposable, filed away until the politics align. Miller held up a declassified email chain. White House advisors instructed DHS to avoid actions that might undermine compassionate enforcement messaging. Not legal concerns, optics. Van Hollen, his voice barely audible, said, You're reading motives into planning. Hawley replied, Motives are clear when every outcome serves the same political goal, and no one stops it. The final set of documents appeared on the screen, verified by Senate oversight staff. Miller cited 12 instances of DHS instructions to delay action post-ruling. Kennedy read 3 lines from a memo, await White House guidance. Too politically sensitive pre-midterms, maintain status quo to avoid narrative disruption. AOC pushed back, her voice sharp. Those are drafts, not orders. Vance countered, and the strategy succeeded. The ruling was ignored. The deportation stood, and you shaped the narrative with silence. Van Hollen tried again, his tone weary. Compliance isn't a single step. It's a process. Kennedy cut in. You had nearly a year. That's not a process. It's a choice. Miller added, no reversal requests were filed until this hearing became public. You acted only when exposed. The hearing neared its close, but the damage was done not in outbursts, but in the weight of what wasn't said. Raskin's final attempt. This was about oversight, not timelines, rang hollow. Vance replied, your delays tell a different story. You didn't honor the court. You managed around it. The room was silent, the press gallery scribbling furiously. C-SPAN viewership surged the chat, repeating one phrase. They had the ruling. They chose silence. Van Hollen's final words were soft. I wasn't informed of any directive. Hawley closed the session, his voice steady. These documents will be submitted to the Office of the Inspector General for independent review. No conclusions are drawn, but the questions are now public. The gavel fell, its sound sharp and final. The Democratic side emptied quietly. AOC slipped past the cameras, avoiding questions. Raskin offered no comment to the waiting reporters. Van Hollen lingered, his gaze fixed on the blank screen where the incriminating memo had been displayed, its words seared into memory. Outside, the media frenzy intensified. Headlines shifted. Hearing backfires. Democratic inaction exposed. Kennedy paused as a reporter called out, is this just political theater? He didn't slow his stride, replying simply, sometimes the truth emerges when you hand someone a microphone and let them speak. The chamber stood empty, a single copy of the Supreme Court's 9-0 ruling left open on the witness table, its pages untouched. The vents hummed softly, the flags behind the podium motionless. There was no applause, no climax, just a quiet reckoning. The Democrats had sought to expose Republican failures, but their own silence spoke louder. An ignored ruling, a blank calendar, an unopened file. These were the truths that echoed beyond the chamber, revealing a narrative they could no longer control.